Well, James Glanz is an investigative reporter with the New York Times, and he has been writing a series on internet data centers around the country. Mr. Glanz, first of all, what is an internet data center?
Well, it's the place that all the information you send out from your computer or your mobile device goes to get processed and stored before it comes back with whatever you asked for, directions to a restaurant or the information in your bank account.
So how big are these centers?
Well, they're actually colossal. They're colossal mainly in the amount of electricity that they use. Some of them use as much electricity as a medium-sized town, as we point out in the article. They're large in size as well, but it's a very secretive industry, and so they tend to be hiding in plain sight. You'll see something that looks like a big box store from the highway, but there's no name on it. Sometimes you'll see little diesel generators on the side. Those are backup power supplies, and it's a data center.
And where are these located?
You know, they're all over the place. They're in high-rises in cities. They're in greenfield sites out in suburban areas. They're tucked away in the back of offices because they are the way that most commerce takes place now, and so everyone has to have one. There are concentrations of them in the country. I looked in Northern Virginia. Obviously, Silicon Valley is another spot. But they're really everywhere at this point.
Who runs them?
A variety of players. I mean, for one thing, companies that need these for their regular business own some of these data centers, everything from Walmart to Microsoft. But there's also a culture or a commerce of renting space in data centers, huge data centers, and those are lesser known names like Equinix, for example, is one that was mentioned briefly in the piece that will sell you time on servers or space for your servers.
Mr. Glanz, what's contained within these warehouse buildings?
Well, they're actually fairly boring places to visit. They're all stacked with these computers, modular computers called servers, one after the other after the other. It doesn't look like much, but they draw a lot of electricity, and all the things that we rely on when we use the internet, from the routing that we need to have our information go where we intend it to go, to the processing we need to happen when that information arrives at one of these data centers. It all happens in these anonymous looking boxes called servers, thousands upon thousands of these things.
So if somebody has a Gmail account or a Yahoo account and they send it from their home computer, that email goes through one of these servers perhaps?
It may. For an example that people often sort of make a mistake on, you send an email to your buddy on the same block. Well, if you have, say, a Yahoo account, let's say, normally what's going to happen is that information has to go find the server, could be 1,000 miles away, on which your information is stored, update your account, and then send the information to your buddy down the street. It's traveled 2,000 miles, but the information's only gone a block.
And how does this information travel from a home computer, a work computer, whatever? Is it through electric lines?
It's everything. I mean, the mobile devices, of course, start with the wireless signal, and then it'll travel eventually through probably fiber optics until it finds the data center that might be in Washington State or Montana or somewhere in Florida. And then the business you need to have done will happen, and it will come back, maybe not along the same route, but some sort of circuitous route. Could go through electrical cables, as you said, could go through fiber optics, comes back to your device, and it's all sort of magic, but it's very complicated.
James Glanz, if we buy something on Amazon, if we have bank online, if we do a Google search, is that information stored in these data centers?
It may be stored. It's certainly processed there. You know, some information, we create so much information. There's some figures in the piece. There's so many zeros, I'll get them wrong if I try to do them off the cuff. But of the information we create in doing all these actions that you just described, some of it's kind of short-lived information. You know, it goes out, you get back the answer that you want, and it sort of evaporates. It's gone. It's just existed in that time you needed it. Other information, when you go and bank online, or you buy something at Amazon and it has to keep a record of that transaction, both for its own inventory and for your billing records, you know, that stays alive for basically forever.
So are these data centers the so-called cloud?
Well, cloud is a funny term. It's used in two different ways. Again, this is sort of spelled out in the piece, but in some people's minds, the cloud is just anything that happens in a data center. I mean, it's just the magical stuff that happens when you send out this request, your email or your request for a menu to some restaurant, and it comes back. They'll call that the cloud. Now, that's a general way of speaking about the digital world, and that's fine. Technical people in this industry refine it further, and they refer to the cloud as a service in which you can rent computing space that you need while you need it. And that way you don't have to have a computer sitting on your desk to do some sort of processing. It's done off in this rentable space, which is called the cloud. So it means two different things.
Now, in one of your articles that you've written for the New York Times, you write, a year-long examination by the New York Times has revealed that this foundation of the information industry is sharply at odds with its image of sleek efficiency and environmental friendliness. Most data centers, by design, consume vast amounts of energy in an incongruously wasteful manner, interviews and documents show.
That's right. Yeah, and we also point out that different players in this industry do behave differently. So there are better players and there are more wasteful players. There is a range. We're sort of talking about the typical data center, the data centers that are using most of the energy out there doing these digital tasks, everything from banks to big department stores. And what I meant by that was that the computers in these data centers typically are actually not doing anything but drawing electricity for the most part. Most of the electricity, in fact, the large majority of the electricity that goes into a typical data center is really powering a computer that's waiting for something to do. And these things, once they're turned on, because we as consumers insist that this infrastructure always be available and never run out of capacity, those computers are sitting there just waiting for us to call upon them to do something. Whether it's day or night, the dead of night when nobody's really asking for the service, or the middle of the day when everyone is, they're all always on. And it's kind of a built-in way of operating in this industry that has developed, that of course, as you'll see from the piece, has developed a lot of critics.
Well, also in your piece, you write about their energy use. Worldwide, the digital warehouses use about 30 billion watts of electricity, roughly equivalent to the output of 30 nuclear power plants, according to estimates industry experts compiled for the Times. Data centers in the U.S. account for 1/4 to 1/3 of that load, the estimates show. And then you quote Peter Gross, who has helped design data centers. A single data center can take more power than a medium-sized town.
That's right, and that work that you mentioned on the electricity usage was done by Jonathan Koomey, a researcher at Stanford, and Data Center Dynamics, which is a London firm, and those are solid numbers. And some people ask, well, is that energy that's being used all the time or part of the time? Well, it's being used all of the time. So data centers, once a data center turns on, typically again, it has a steady load. So it's always day or night, whether it's August, September, January, anytime. They're drawing about that amount of electricity worldwide right now, according to the best estimates of the best people in the field. That's the way it works. Why does it work that way? Well, in part it is because, again, the way that this has grown, this field has grown from a few computers in someone's dorm room or a back office now to these gigantic facilities on which so much business depends, and where consumers always expect these services to be ready at the touch of a button or the tap on a screen. They've just gotten to the point where they turn them on and they leave them on. And that's really why the figure is both so high but also so continuous over the course of a year and a day. Now, James Glanz, you also write that up to 90% of the electricity used by these data centers can be considered wasted electricity. Well, that's what I'm saying. There's first again, players in this area vary a lot, and some do better than others, as we said in the piece. Some companies have made progress in reducing things like how much they need to use to cool these computers, how much electricity they use cooling computers. But what I was referring to there is something called computer utilization, and that means that take the total brain power in one of these giant data centers at any given time. Well, in the big bulk of the field, a typical data center, again, most of that brain power is idle. It draws about the same amount of electricity as if it were doing something, but in fact, it's mostly idle, and then therefore most of the power going into that data center is really powering idle computing, and we call that waste, because there are ways to reduce that substantially with techniques that exist right now.
Then why aren't those techniques more widely used?
Well, that's one of the reasons it took me a year or more to report the story, because I needed to find out that question, answer that question. And it turns out to be something very counterintuitive, which is we think of this industry, the digital industry, as being very forward-leaning and ready to take risks. But in fact, the world of the data centers, it's very much like an old line industry. It's a very risk-averse kind of an industry right now, because if the data center goes down, somebody loses a job, a business can be lost, consumers are going to be irate. Think how people behave if their favorite website is down for 5 minutes. So in the core of this field has been built in an incredible conservatism and risk aversion that leads them to just sort of throw more servers at this issue, at this problem, rather than using some other kind of technology that's newer, available, but might be a little scary if you're the person whose job is going to be lost when that data center goes down.
Internet-based industries have honed a reputation for sleek, clean convenience based on the magic they deliver to screens everywhere. At the heart of every internet enterprise are data centers, which have become more sprawling and ubiquitous as the amount of stored information explodes, sprouting in community after community. But the Microsoft experience in Quincy, Washington, shows that when these internet factories come to town, they can feel a bit more like old-time manufacturing than modern magic. What's the Quincy, Washington story?
Well, the story we set out to tell there was just sort of Microsoft comes to town. It's a small town, around 7,000 people. It has one quality that sets it apart from a lot of other small towns, and that's that it sits near the Columbia River and a couple of hydroelectric dams that produce very, very cheap and very, very continuous power. So Microsoft came to town in 2005 or so, 2006, and what the story sort of shows is that while you have this kind of green, again up to the minute, corporate image of what a digital company like Microsoft, they're certainly not alone here, what that sort of company is, it's really a lot more like a traditional industry coming to town when you're on the ground living next to it. It uses power, uses a lot of power. It throws its elbows around when it wants to, sort of get its way, as we described in one telling incident there in the piece. And not that they're all that much better or worse, let's say, than some other industry you might name, say, paper industry. They're just sort of not that different at the level of the facilities. That's what our reporting showed, at least in the case of Quincy and the situation that we described in the piece.
Are there environmental concerns when it comes to these data centers?
Well, I think the first one is the amount of electricity they're using and just sort of justifying whether that is too much. People obviously want the services that these data centers provide, but the question is if people knew how much could be saved, how would they feel about that? And I don't think that we have the answer to those questions because we haven't been given those answers to us by the industry. But the other issue is because the data centers can never go down, they have to have a lot of backup power available. And they're little power plants in themselves. They have banks of huge diesel generators. And companies, and this is in case the grid goes down, in case there's a blackout. And even if there's a very small outage on the grid, there are these banks of batteries, thousands of them. They're like car or truck batteries ready in many data centers to take over. So when you test those diesel engines, or when you use them for other purposes, which some companies do, despite their claims that they're only for backup in an emergency, they're actually not always used that way. They're used other times. They emit diesel exhaust fumes, and they have caused not in my backyard fights in Quincy. It's one place where a certain citizens group took on Microsoft, challenged the legality of its permits for those generators. But it's not the only place where this issue has come up. And it's just a really unknown part of the internet and this digital business that we uncovered, wrote about in these pieces.
Have there been environmental fines associated with these data centers?
Absolutely, yeah. We have a whole chapter on the case of Amazon in Northern Virginia, another very popular place for data centers, partly because energy prices are low and the power is reliable. But Amazon was assessed large fines. Don't recall the exact numbers. Around $200,000, I think, was the final number there after negotiations with Amazon lawyers, which is very high in that world. You don't see fines that high very often. It was described to me as on the upper end of the sort of fines that were levied, and that was partly because they were not properly getting environmental permits for those diesel generators. They were running them, and therefore, of course, causing emissions without obtaining the proper permits. They tell me that they have now obtained those permits in Northern Virginia. That's what Amazon told me when I contacted them for this story. James
Glanz, the Quincy experience, how is it that Quincy has become a growth area for these data centers? There have been some others that have opened up besides Microsoft, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Half a dozen. I mean, Yahoo is right there. Microsoft is the biggest. Intuit is there, the tax calculating company, and a few others. These data centers, for whatever reason, tend to cluster. I mean, part of the reason is that if energy prices are low, you'll get a lot of these data centers coming in. But you have other factors that sort of come into play. One is connectivity to the fiber optic. There's a lot of fiber optic in Quincy. They put that in at one point. Other things like tax breaks are very important to these companies. We mentioned that they receive lucrative tax breaks in that area. It's all sort of a nexus of factors, and the result of companies sort of sifting through those factors in some way I don't completely understand. Those are some of the factors, though. They tend to produce real bunches of these data centers in certain parts of the country.
So are these desired by communities to get a data center? Is it like a factory opening up in a community?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think on the level of town leadership, they're very much liked because they do increase the tax base. For example, the property taxes being collected in Quincy have increased a lot since the first data centers came in. Not all because of the data centers, but they attracted some other business as well, I'm sure. And that's a positive thing. I think where they get criticism is that in a place like Quincy, they use tremendous amounts of power, as I said, far more than the town itself. And they create a pretty modest number of jobs, and that's sort of a debate that goes on locally. The other thing that you see is that because data centers it's a very secretive business. They often, the data centers you're mentioning in Quincy, I can't think of a single one that has the name of the company on the outside of the data center. I think Yahoo used to have it and actually took it down, from what I could tell when I was out there. It doesn't necessarily build great community relations. I don't know if that's a make or break issue, but they're not really much for the outreach, let's say, into the local communities.
Why so much secretiveness, and are they heavily secured?
They are. It depends on who you talk to on that one. The companies will say that they're trying to guard against mischief, some kind of cyber attack, something like that. But at the same time, I think there are reasons that are more matters of convenience. They don't particularly want the world to be peeking into how much energy they're using. It's sort of not a good thing for them, not a good message for them. Sometimes they say it's a competitive issue. If people knew how much energy they were using, might be able to decode something about their operations. But I think more than anything, to tell you the truth, Peter, it's really a matter of habit. They've gotten used to doing this without any scrutiny. And I just found a lot of astonishment when I would walk up to the door as a reporter and say, "Hi, I'm from the New York Times. I'm going to write about your data center." It's just that kind of world.
What was the response when you walked up to the door and said, "Hi, I'm from the New York Times"? What was Silicon Valley's response to that?
Well, walking right up to the door never worked. Let's put it that way. I actually did that a couple of times, but. Well, you do find, you find the great thing about reporting, around the world, but in this country as well, is that there's always somebody there to tell the story, who wants to tell the story. I call them truth tellers. And so I found the right people to get me some access to the data centers. I wanted to see at least some of them, and was able to get in that way. But it was never easy, and I was shot down many times, figuratively shot down, in trying to gain access to the data centers and just have a look inside.
So, James Glanz, do these data centers employ a lot of people? Are they high-tech jobs?
Well, that's where you get debate. I think that there's no question, I think I can say uncontroversially, that they really don't employ that many people, because you take that huge data center in Quincy, the Microsoft data center you mentioned. Again, I don't have the figures right with me, but somewhere between 50 and 150 jobs, I think, would be a fair statement. But it's using amounts of electricity that were more characteristic of heavy manufacturing. What I showed in the piece was that the data center industry in the United States uses about as much electricity from the grid as the paper industry does. But of course, the employment situation is a different one. Now, communities will also say, and this is a fair statement, especially leaders of communities, that for a town like Quincy, that's a lot of jobs. So that's where the debate takes place, and it wasn't a central thesis of my story. So I don't think I want to go too far on that, but it is definitely a point of debate.
Nationwide, you write, data centers used about 76 billion kilowatt hours in 2010, or roughly 2% of all electricity used in the country that year. And you go on to say that Google's data centers consume nearly 300 million watts and Facebook's about 60 million watts. Can you help us put those 300 million watts and 60 million watts into perspective a little bit? How much energy is that?
Well, a light bulb uses 100 watts. It's a lot of energy. First of all, I have to say that Facebook and Google are some of the more enlightened players in relative terms as to how they use that electricity. And I think this is an evolving conversation as to what does responsible mean, but they're more forward-leaning than, let's say, many banks or big box stores or something like that, in how the kind of technology they use to try to reduce the waste. Nevertheless, even in those cases, what these figures show you is that this is an incredibly energy-intensive industry. Last year, after I asked Google for its energy figures, it had never released them until I started this reporting. I'm not saying they did it only because I asked them to, but I bothered them enough that maybe it played a role in their decision to release their figures last year for the first time, and they did again this year. Last year, the figure was around almost 250 million watts. This year, it's 300, so that's a growth of 50 in just 1 year. And remember that a town like Quincy, let's just take a town of 7,000. If you look at the houses and the small businesses in Quincy, I think they may be using something more like 10 megawatts or something like that. So you're talking about the amounts that large urban areas would use, or extremely large steel plants or something like that. That's the order that we're speaking about. And when you mentioned 2%, 2% is roughly the amount that a lot of large industries use. If you look at the transportation manufacturing industry, it's around 2%. If you look at the pulp industry in the United States, I'm talking now, it's about 2% of the total. And there are some other, in fact, the steel industry, it's hard to compare apples to apples in all these industries. They're very different. But if you just look at the energy they're using from the grid, again, the steel industry is in that same area. So basically, data centers have arrived as a heavy industry in terms of how much electricity they are using from the grid in the United States.
And just to help put that even more into perspective, you also write that 48 million watts equals about 29,000 homes. James Glanz, you also quote Mark Bromfitt, an analyst, saying that if companies don't change their practices, they will hit a brick wall. What does that mean?
Well, Mr. Bromfitt is in a unique position. He was an executive, let's say, a technical official at PG&E, which is one of the nation's largest utilities. It's focused in California, and his job was to follow data centers. And now he looks at both the utility aspects of data centers and their IT practices, their computer practices. And what he's talking about is that this has gone on, this growth has happened behind the scenes so quickly and with so little scrutiny that some of these practices that he sees as extremely wasteful are taking them into a realm of energy usage which he doesn't think that they'll be able to sustain. One, because it'll be too expensive. Two, probably because they'll get more scrutiny as those numbers increase. And three, I didn't talk about this with him, but other sources have told me that competition is going to start to play a role here, that people who learn, companies who learn and decide to put into practice ways to reduce those amounts are going to have a competitive advantage. So I think all of those things are what he means by unsustainable.
And finally, James Glanz, you also write that there are over 2,000 federal data centers. Were you able to explore those at all?
A little bit, yeah. A lot of federal data centers are labeled secret, right? So you can't go there. Some of those are the biggest users of electricity. National Security Administration did not invite me in for a visit. I did visit in the course of the reporting an IRS, a Social Security Administration data center in the Baltimore area, and fascinating. But when you realize the rest of the world, the commercial world, the world we see all the time, is pushing all of its business into data centers, so is the federal government. And the increase in the number of those data centers since I forget when the survey was first done until the present day is pretty astonishing. I mean, I think they saw a quadrupling or something like that of the number over a very short period, and that's because the federal government is doing the same thing that the rest of the world is doing. It's putting all its business in data centers, and that is being done without much scrutiny.
And unfortunately, we are out of time. James Glanz is an investigative reporter with the New York Times. His series is available at nytimes.com, or it's available on our website, cspan.org/communicators. Mr. Glanz, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Pleasure.